I need to tell you about the moment I realized Europe had just committed the most spectacular act of financial suicide I witnessed in my 30-year career. It was November 2025, and I was in a closed-door meeting in Brussels when a senior EU official whispered something that made my blood run cold. "Yanis," he said, glancing nervously around the room, "we thought seizing those Russian assets would be our masterstroke. Instead, we may have just destroyed the European financial system." Putin's response: nobody saw it coming. What happened next wasn't just geopolitical maneuvering. It was the systematic demolition of European economic power by a country that was supposed to be isolated, sanctioned, and defeated. And the terrifying part? Europe handed Putin the blueprint for their own destruction. Let me take you back to understand how impossible this reversal should have been. In November 2025, European leaders made what they thought was a brilliant move. They seized $15 billion in frozen Russian central bank reserves and transferred the money directly to Ukraine. Politicians competed to claim credit. Media celebrated as justice for Ukrainian suffering. EU officials praised their own courage in the face of Russian aggression. The legal framework was creative. They called it reparations for Russian aggression. European lawyers had warned that outright confiscation violated international law, undermined sovereign reserve sanctity, and created dangerous precedents. Politicians ignored these warnings. They wanted a victory, something tangible to show their publics that Western resolve had consequences. Russia's initial response seemed muted. A few angry statements from the foreign ministry, the usual promises of retaliation, standard diplomatic rhetoric. Western analysts dismissed it as bluster. What could Russia actually do? They were already sanctioned, already isolated, already cut off from Western markets. This was Europe's fatal miscalculation. 3 days after the seizure, I received a call from a former colleague at the European Central Bank. Her voice was shaking. "Yanis, you need to see what Russia just announced. It's not what we expected. It's so much worse." That phone call led me to discover Russia's three-wave retaliation strategy that would fundamentally reshape global finance. Wave 1 hit European boardrooms like an earthquake. Russia announced the immediate nationalization of all European corporate assets on Russian territory. BP's stake in Rosneft, $14 billion, gone. Shell's Russian operations, $3 billion, seized. Total Energy's projects, $4 billion, confiscated. German automotive plants, pharmaceutical operations, food processing facilities, retail chains. Everything European companies owned in Russia became Russian state property overnight. The total value exceeded $120 billion, more than 8 times what the EU had seized. I was in Frankfurt the day after this announcement, and the panic was palpable. German automotive executives were in emergency sessions. French energy company boards called crisis meetings. Stock prices plummeted across European exchanges. Insurance companies faced massive claims they couldn't possibly cover. But this was just Russia warming up. Wave 2 revealed the true sophistication of their strategy. Russia announced that all remaining energy exports to Europe would be priced exclusively in rubles or yuan. No euros accepted. This wasn't cutting supply. That would hurt Russian revenues. This was forcing a currency choice that would humiliate the euro while strengthening Russia's financial position. European countries that needed Russian gas or oil had to acquire rubles first. This meant going through Russian financial intermediaries, paying fees, accepting exchange rate risk, losing pricing transparency, but the psychological impact was devastating. By refusing euros, Russia was making a statement: your currency is no longer acceptable to us. I witnessed the immediate effects during a Bank of England meeting that month. European energy importers were dumping euros to buy rubles, creating massive selling pressure on European currency. The ruble, which Western sanctions were supposed to destroy, began strengthening. The euro, which Europeans assumed was a global reserve currency anyone would accept, was being rejected by a major commodity exporter. China benefited enormously. Countries buying Russian energy in yuan had to acquire yuan first, accelerating Chinese currency, internationalization at European expense. The European Central Bank watched helplessly as energy importers abandoned euros for rubles and yuan, weakening European currency and importing inflation through depreciation. But Wave 3 was the move that truly shocked European capitals and revealed Putin's strategic brilliance. Russia announced creation of the BRICS Plus Reserve Fund, a $150 billion pool capitalized by Russia, China, India, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and other nations that had grown wary of Western financial weaponization. The fund's innovation wasn't just providing liquidity for sanctioned countries. It was the mechanism: assets held in distributed custody across multiple non-Western jurisdictions. No single country could freeze them. No Western court could seize them. The assets were legally structured to be seizure-proof. 6 months later, I was in Dubai, attending a sovereign wealth fund conference, when I learned the true scope of what Russia had triggered. A Saudi fund manager pulled me aside after his presentation. "Professor," he whispered, "we're quietly diversifying away from European assets. Not selling everything, but reducing concentration. If they seize Russian reserves, what stops them from seizing ours in a future dispute?" The capital flight began immediately and hasn't stopped. Saudi Arabia, UAE, China, even neutral countries like Switzerland started reducing European asset exposure. The amounts involved were staggering. Even a 10% reduction in sovereign holdings represents hundreds of billions in selling pressure on European bonds. European government borrowing costs increased precisely when they needed to borrow more for Ukraine aid and energy transition spending. The European Central Bank faced an impossible choice: intervene to support bond markets and reignite inflation, or let yields rise and watch governments struggle with debt service costs. Let me show you the human cost of this strategic blunder. Germany was hit hardest because German manufacturers had invested more heavily in Russia than any other European nation. BMW's plant in Kaliningrad gone, Volkswagen's operations seized, Mercedes facilities nationalized. These weren't just sunk costs but future revenue streams and competitive positioning built over decades. I spoke with a German automotive executive last spring whose company lost $8 billion in Russian assets overnight. "We spent 15 years building those operations," he told me bitterly. "Now our Chinese competitors will benefit from facilities we built with German engineering and investment. We didn't just lose money, we handed our competitive advantages to rivals." The energy situation became acutely painful for countries still dependent on Russian supplies. Hungary adapted quickly, setting up ruble accounts to continue energy imports. But this created political tensions within the EU. Countries that refused Russian energy on principle watched Hungary get cheaper energy by accepting ruble payments. Austria, Slovakia, parts of Eastern Europe face similar choices: accept ruble payments and get energy, or refuse and face higher costs from alternative suppliers. EU unity on Russia policy began fragmenting along energy dependency lines, exactly what Putin wanted. But the precedent effect proved even more damaging than immediate economic impact. Every country with reserves in European financial institutions had to reconsider their safety. If the EU would seize Russian assets, what stops them from seizing Chinese assets during Taiwan tensions? Or Saudi assets during oil disputes? The answer: nothing stops them. The precedent was set. This triggered what analysts call a confidence crisis in sovereign asset safety. Central banks exist to manage reserves prudently, and prudent management means minimizing risk. If European assets carry seizure risk, they're imprudent holdings. The logical response is diversification away from potential seizure jurisdictions. Last month, I had dinner with a Swiss banker who's watched this unfold from Zurich's unique perspective. "Yanis," he said, "we're seeing capital flows we haven't seen since the Cold War. Countries are moving money to jurisdictions with stronger property rights protections. Ironically, some are choosing China over Europe because Beijing looks more predictable than Brussels. The long-term strategic damage is profound. For decades, Europe benefited from being seen as a safe, neutral place to park money. Swiss banking secrecy, Luxembourg fund structures, London financial services, European financial centers competed with New York to attract global capital. The euro was promoted as an alternative reserve currency to the dollar. This positioning depended on trust that property rights would be respected, that political disputes wouldn't trigger asset seizures, that rule of law would prevail over geopolitical expediency. The Russian asset seizure shattered that trust permanently. China emerged as the massive winner from Europe's mistake. Every dollar of reduced European asset holdings went somewhere, and much went to Chinese assets or yuan-denominated instruments. China positioned itself as the protector of sovereign asset rights, the defender of financial stability against Western weaponization. The irony is brutal. Europe seized Russian assets to punish Russian aggression. The main beneficiary was China, Europe's strategic rival. The legal framework Europe created to justify confiscation will be cited by authoritarian regimes worldwide to seize Western assets in future disputes. European policymakers are now quietly admitting the mistake. Off the record, officials concede the asset seizure was premature and insufficiently considered, that Russian response was more sophisticated than anticipated, that long-term costs exceed short-term benefits, but publicly they can't admit error without looking weak. Let me show you the scenario playing out in 2026. European government bond yields are 150 basis points higher than they would be without the confidence crisis. This means European governments pay an extra $50, $60 billion annually in interest costs. Over a decade, that's $500, $600 billion, 5 to 6 times the amount transferred to Ukraine. The euro has depreciated 8% against a basket of currencies as reserve managers diversify away from European assets. This imports inflation through higher costs for everything from electronics to energy to food. European companies have written off $120 billion in Russian assets, reducing corporate profitability and tax revenues. Meanwhile, Russia has adapted. They've replaced European corporate assets with domestic alternatives or Chinese partnerships. They've diversified export markets and strengthened non-Western financial ties. The sanctions and seizures supposed to weaken Russia instead accelerated their pivot away from Europe. The historical parallel is instructive. After World War I, the Allies imposed harsh reparations on Germany to pay for war damage and prevent rearmament. Instead, it destabilized the Weimar Republic and created conditions for extremism. Eventually, reparations were reduced and abandoned as counterproductive. The Russian asset seizure may follow a similar trajectory. Initially celebrated, then regretted, eventually partially reversed as costs become undeniable. But the damage is done. Countries will remember that European asset custody isn't safe, that political disputes can trigger confiscation, that international law is flexible when Europe wants it to be. For 80 years, the post-World War II financial system operated on certain principles: respect for sovereign property rights, sanctity of central bank reserves, political neutrality of financial infrastructure. The Russian asset seizure shattered these principles explicitly. Once these principles are broken, they can't be easily restored. China has accelerated development of alternative systems, not because Chinese systems are better, but because they're not controlled by those who seized Russian assets. This bifurcation of global finance is Europe's legacy from the asset seizure. The tragedy is this was avoidable. Europe could have maintained the asset freeze indefinitely, using asset return as a bargaining chip in future negotiations. Instead, they chose outright seizure and transfer to Ukraine. This satisfied political demands, but was strategically foolish. Ukraine received $15 billion it desperately needed. But Europe paid hundreds of billions in lost investment, capital flight, and strategic positioning. They asked the wrong question. They wondered if giving Ukraine $15 billion was worthwhile, not whether it was worth undermining European financial credibility for decades. This is how empires decline, through accumulated strategic mistakes that seem small at the time but compound into disaster. Europe is financially weaker, the euro less trusted, European assets less attractive. Russia found new partners and payment systems. China gained enormously from offering alternatives to Western financial infrastructure. The $15 billion asset seizure will be studied in future economics courses as a case study in how not to conduct financial warfare. When you weaponize the financial system, you create incentives for others to build alternatives. Once alternatives exist, your weapon loses its power. Europe just learned this lesson the hard way.